Awesome. All right, we're going to jump into part 2 of our series. We kicked this off last week. It's a series we're calling Kinda Fishy. It's a study on the book of Jonah. And if you weren't here last week, I'll fill you in on how we got here. Like, why are we even talking about this? I told you last week, at the beginning of the year, I was planning out our teaching calendar for the rest of 2025. And my 6-year-old daughter asked me, she said, hey, could you do like a series on Jonah and the big fish? And I was like, sure, you betcha. I could do that. So she was so excited for this series. I mean, she's been waiting all year asking me, hey, Dad, when are you talking about Jonah? When are you talking about Jonah? So she found out that I was starting to talk about Jonah last week. And so she was like, hey, can I come here? I want to hear Dad talk about Jonah. So she actually, some of you may have noticed, she actually came in last week and sat in through the whole service to hear Dad talk about Jonah. Now, on the drive home from lunch last week, I said, hey, what'd you think of church today? She said, it was a little boring. I was like, what? She goes, well, you didn't talk about Jonah that much. And I was like, okay, well, I kind of get it. I didn't really prepare you for that very well. So today she is spending her 15 Bible bucks in Co-Kids this morning and having a much better time. But I'm excited more than she is about part 2 of our series on Jonah. Now, I'll tell you this before we dive in. I want to kind of play a game this morning. Can we play a game? Is that okay? A little bit? All right, so here's the game, and it's like the simplest game you've ever probably played, ever. I'm going to show you a picture in a second, and then I want you guys to tell me what you saw in the picture, okay? And you've seen things like this before. It's not new, all right? I'm going to put a picture up just for a second, and then I want you guys to tell me what you saw in the picture. Most of you have seen this one before. All right, let's put this one up real quick. All right, how many of you, just a quick poll, how many of you the first thing you saw when you look at this was 2 faces, right? 2 faces. How many of you the first thing you saw when you look at this was a vase? Right? A few of you, right? Now, how many of you have seen this one before so you knew that it was 2 faces and a vase? Yeah, right. Okay, easy question, right? We started out with the easy one. All right, let's put this next one up. We got another one. I want you to tell me what you see. All right, take a look at this for a second. All right, let's take it off real quick. How many of you saw the girl is facing towards you? Okay, a few of you, yeah. Actually, half of you, yeah. Okay. How many of you saw the girl as facing away from you when you think about it? She's facing away from you, yeah. Okay, which one's the right answer? There really is no right answer to that, but it's just interesting, right? All right, let's put the next one up. This one's kind of fun. This was a picture taken for National Geographic in 1997, so this is like in the time machine. Some of you weren't born when this picture was taken. Here's the fun thing about this. All right, so just tell me real quick, which head belongs to which cheetah? Isn't that trippy? Like, how many of you think like the one, all right, we'll just say like the cheetah that's in the front has the head on the left. How many of you see that? Okay. How many of you like the cheetah on the front, his head's on the right? How many of you are still not sure? You know what I mean? Like I've looked at this like 30 times and I'm still not sure. What's funny about this is they actually like called the photographer after they developed the film. I mean, remember this is 1997. They developed the film. They called the photographer and they're like, hey, which head goes with which cheetah? And he's like, I don't know. I don't even remember, Like, it's just wild. But anyway, now, dumb pictures, right? But I show you this really just to kind of kick us off with a point this morning that's going to be really important, not right now, but in a few minutes as we get into the story of Jonah. And the point in all of this is simply this. It is quite possible for 2 people to look at the same thing and see it 2 different ways. It's quite possible for 2 people to look at the same thing and see it 2 different ways. And that, quite honestly, is the case in many ways when it comes to the book and the story of Jonah. Okay, now here we have another picture from National Geographic right here. No, I'm just kidding. It's dumb. Dumb. All right, here's the thing about this. All right, when it comes to the book of Jonah, this is fascinating. And I'm going to nerd out for just a couple minutes. If you don't geek in this way, just hang with me just for a minute because we're going somewhere. All right, when you look at the book of Jonah, scholars have been studying the book of Jonah for hundreds of years. And even to this day, scholars still debate about how to look at the book of Jonah. Now, if you weren't here last week, I'll catch you up a little bit on the book of Jonah and tell you a little bit about what's so unique about it as a book. Now, the book of Jonah, if you're not familiar with it, falls in our Bible in what we call the Old Testament, which is the first half of our Bible, kind of like the pre-Jesus portion of our Bible, okay? The book of Jonah is found in what's called a category of books called the prophets, which are basically people who received messages from God and proclaimed those messages out to a group of people in their time and in their place. Now, the book of prophets gets kind of subdivided, the category of prophets gets subdivided into 2 groups. The major prophets, which there are 12 of those, and 5 of those, and the minor prophets, which there are 12 of those. And if you weren't here last week, you might be asking, what's the difference between the major prophets and the minor prophets? Does anybody remember from last week? What makes the major prophets major? That's right. They're longer. They just said more. You know what I mean? So like, you guys get your own category, the long-winded preachers, kind of land in the major prophets category. Jonah is one of the 12 minor prophets. And as I told you last week, I would even suggest that Jonah in many ways kind of comes across as the minorest of the prophets, if we can just make up a term, right? He's kind of the minorest of the prophets. In fact, when you look at the book of Jonah, he's kind of like the odd duck of the Old Testament. I mean, he just like breaks all the rules, doesn't fall into any category cleanly, and stands out so differently. In fact, I told you last week, all of the other books of the prophets, all 17 or 16 of those, are primarily comprised of like what we call sermons, like words that were said by these prophets, proclaimed out to a group of people. Jonah is written not with a bunch of sermons or with a bunch of words from Jonah. Jonah is written as a story about Jonah. In fact, when it comes time for Jonah to like declare his message from God in the original language, it lasts all of like 5 words. That's all that he says, and that's it, right? The rest of the book is just story, which is massively different from any of the other prophets. All the other books of prophets kind of elevate the prophet that their book is about, right? When you read books like Nehemiah or Obadiah or Amos, they all elevate and kind of like prop up or like paint a positive picture of the person who their book is about. The book of Jonah, on the other hand, over and over again, criticizes Jonah and actually like tears him down and like kind of rips him apart a little bit. Like kind of like you kind of look at him, you're like, I don't think I'd want to be like him when I grow up. I mean, it's just completely different in the way that it's written, which has caused scholars to look at it from 2 different perspectives and still to this day debate, right? Why and how it was written. And so on one hand, you have a group of scholars who are like quite confident that this book is purely historical, that the book of Jonah is purely historical. It's about a certain person in a historical place, right? A historical Jonah who goes on a historical ship and experiences a historical fish and goes to another historical city and declares a historical message. And then the whole thing is like word for word, fact for fact, is purely historical. On the other hand, you have another group of scholars who are also well-committed followers of Jesus, who look at it and just with perspective and with intentionality and with open hearts just explore the book of Jonah, and they come to the conclusion that the book of Jonah is actually an allegory, right? A story for them. They say it's a story that's not necessarily purely historical, but written for the sake of communicating a message to a historical group of people in their historical time. That it was written to kind of declare a greater point or a greater truth to a group of people in the same way that, at home sometimes I tell stories to my 6-year-old girl named Addie about another 6-year-old girl named Allie who sometimes gets eaten by a lion because she wasn't listening to her parents, like just whatever it takes. Right? Now, are those stories about Allie, right? Are they full of facts? No. Are they full of truth? Oh, yeah. And in the same way, right, many scholars look at the book of Jonah and they say, hey, it's not necessarily full of facts, but it was written to convey and communicate a set of truths. Now, the reason I bring this up this morning is because regardless of how you personally view the book of Jonah, and you can view it a variety of ways, and there's well-intentioned and well-studied followers of Jesus on both sides of the conversation, regardless of where you land in your own perspective. When we dive into chapter 2 of the book of Jonah today, when we dive into that portion of the text, there are at least going to be what I would call like some notes of allegory, right? Like some notes of things that feel so exaggerated that if you actually tried to like connect the dots from a historical perspective, you would spend so much time doing intellectual gymnastics to make it all work just perfectly that you actually just might miss the forest for the trees in the process of all of that. But we're going to see that as we dive into that in just a second. Now, if you weren't with us last week for chapter 1, I'll kind of catch you up in the most brief of ways, but you can study this or read Jonah chapter 1 on your own. We're diving into a story about a man who was actually asked by God to go and declare a message to a group of people in one city. But it was a group of people in a city that he did not care for in the least bit. And so instead, he actually goes the opposite direction to get away from that group of people and to get away from the thing that God was calling him to do. He goes down and he actually buys a ticket or actually pays fare to purchase out this ship and hire this ship to take him across the Mediterranean Sea as far as he can possibly get away from the city that he was called to. Now, while he was on this ship, right, the author tells us that a great storm was sent that really threatened to break the whole ship apart. And Jonah was sleeping in the bottom of the ship, and the captain of the ship comes down and wakes Jonah up and says, hey, we're all praying to our gods. Remember, this is the ancient Near East, very polytheistic culture. He says, hey, we're all praying to our gods. You start praying to your God too. And so everybody's kind of praying to their own individual God. And over the course of time, it becomes known to these sailors on the ship that Jonah's poor decision-making and Jonah's running from the place that he had been called to go to is actually the thing that led for this storm to come upon them. And Jonah finally is like, hey, the only way you're going to get rid of this storm and save yourselves is if you throw me out of the ship and into the water. And that's where we stopped last week. With Jonah left, ship's gone, the storm's settled, and Jonah's in the water. And that's where we're going to pick up in the text this morning. The author of Jonah tells us that in that moment, or shortly after that moment, he says that now the Lord had arranged for a great fish to swallow Jonah. Talk about an exit strategy, So Jonah's in the water, right? In some way, shape, or form, Jonah's in the water, and this great fish comes and swallows Jonah. And I'll just tell you right out of the gate, if I were Jonah and I were in a situation that I couldn't get myself out of, and the God of the universe was arranging a way for me to get out of it, I would probably at least hope for a few different options. You know what I mean? I might like to have a cruise ship, or a ferry, I don't know, a pirate, even pirates, I'd take pirates over a fish. But Jonah gets a fish in this moment. The author tells us that Jonah was inside the fish for 3 days and 3 nights, which is an interesting note that the author makes there, the amount of time that he was in there. And we're going to see this here in a second when we dive further into what happens to Jonah in this moment. But 3 days and 3 nights, we know from an ancient Mesopotamian myth that 3 days and 3 nights in the ancient Near East was the amount of time that people assumed it took to get to what was known as the underworld and back. So they believe that you had the ocean, and then beneath the ocean you had the underworld, which would be the closest thing that we would have in our modern concepts right now would be hell. You know what I mean? Just the lowest place, the worst place, and it takes 3 days. In their mindset, it takes 3 days to get really to hell and back. It's kind of the way that they kind of thought and viewed the world at that time. And so the author tells us that Jonah is in the belly of this ship for 3 days and 3 nights, and you're going to see that theme play out here over the next few verses. Now, he tells us that then Jonah prayed to the Lord his God from inside the fish. Now, at this point, the author actually starts to tell us what had happened to Jonah from the time that he was thrown off the ship until the time that he was swallowed by the fish. But he changes the way in which he communicates to us in this moment. The author now changes the tense and the position. So the author now starts to talk to us through Jonah's eyes and from Jonah's perspective. And he does that through a prayer that Jonah prayed that's written as a poem from the inside of this fish, almost like he's reflecting back on what has just happened to him. And it starts, this prayer that he prays, this poem that's written, starts with a summary statement about the whole experience. He says this, he says, I cried out to the Lord in my great trouble, and he answered me. I called to you from the land of the dead, and Lord, you heard me. He says, so I was in the lowest of places. I went all the way to the deepest parts of the ocean. And you heard me in this moment. That's kind of a summary statement at the start of this poem. And then he goes into details of what happened to him from his perspective. He says, you threw me into the ocean depths, and I sank down to the heart of the sea. The mighty waters engulfed me. I was buried beneath your wild and stormy waves. Because you threw me in. I was swallowed up by all of it. I'm fully underwater. I'm buried. Feels like there's no way out here. Because then I said, oh Lord, you have driven me from your presence. Yet I will look once more toward your holy temple. In other words, hey, God, it feels like you're not even looking at me. But I'm going to look towards you one more time in this moment. It goes, I sank beneath the waves, and the waves closed over me. Seaweed, so he's in the deepest part of the ocean, seaweed wrapped itself around my head. I sank down to the very roots of the mountains. I was imprisoned in the earth, whose gates lock shut forever. In other words, I was trapped. There's no escape. I kind of got myself into this mess, but there's no getting myself out of this mess. And if we were going to kind of summarize, or maybe even if Jonah were going to summarize to us his experience of the past few days that led him to this point, he might just say something like this. First, I went down. Right? Then I was thrown down. Now I'm stuck down. I made a set of choices that put me in a situation that I can no longer choose my way out of. My decisions got me into this mess, but I can't decide my way out of this mess. Now, I'm willing to bet that you've never probably been to the ocean floor, you know. I'm also willing to bet that you've gotten yourself at times, just like I've gotten myself into things at times, that I couldn't get myself out of. I mean, some of us, you could look at this and say something like this, right? Like first I maxed out the credit card. Then the bank turned me over to collections. Now I'm filing for bankruptcy. Or maybe I say like, hey, first I came home late from work every night. Then my spouse told me that they were distant from me. Now we're sitting with the attorney. Or first, I didn't study. Then my professor failed me. Now I'm having to start the whole thing over again. I mean, you've got your versions and you've got your stories. Now here's what's interesting about this for me, just out of curiosity, right? Like, when we tell these kinds of stories in our life, I find this to be true of me and so many of us, right? So often we actually leave out the first line, don't we? Like we start with the second line. Can you believe they did that to me? Can you believe they threw me off that ship? Can you believe the bank? Can you believe that she left? Can you believe that he failed me? We skip the first part and go straight to the second. I think Jonah by this point is just quite honest about all of it and acknowledges all of it, right? And for Jonah, he recognizes that he's at the point of no return. There's no getting himself out of what he's gotten himself into. And now, what's interesting is now in his prayer, he continues to tell us what happened to him. And now when he's at the lowest point in his life, the story begins to change. Watch his tone shift. He says, but you, O Lord my God, snatched me from the jaws of death. Now remember, Jonah's still in the fish. And yet he's like, you snatched me from the jaws of death. It's like, hey, you snatched me from jaws with jaws. You know, like it's just kind of like this interesting, like, but Jonah, you're still in it. He's like, yeah, but it was worse, you know. Because as my life was slipping away, he said, I remembered the Lord, and my earnest prayer went out to you in your holy temple. So I didn't think you were looking at me, but I took a step to look to you. Turns out you actually were listening to me. He summarizes the whole thing like this. He says, those who worship false gods turn their backs on all God's mercies. But I will offer sacrifices to you with songs of praise. And I will fulfill all my vows, for my salvation comes from the Lord alone. To which I read this, and I'm just kind of like, but Jonah, you're not saved yet. Like Jonah, you're still inside a fish. And Jonah just kind of seems to be like, but I wasn't abandoned either. He's in the in-between. He's in that space that exists between not being in the lowest point of your life and having everything put back together in your life. He's in that space of waiting and processing. He's in that space of sitting. He's in that space of shifting and changing and finding a new perspective and finding a new attitude. He's not saved yet, but he's also not abandoned in this moment. And the author tells us that after he prayed this prayer, after we get this perspective of his life, then the Lord ordered the fish to spit Jonah out onto the beach. And the probably the most clear way of translating that would be like vomited him out onto the beach, which again, I could think of better ways to be rescued, but you get what you get and you don't throw a fit, I guess. That's what my 6-year-old tells me. No. Here's my thing about this, all right? All of this is kind of interesting, okay? It's just interesting to me the way that he prays, the way that he processes, the way that he thinks, the ways that he holds a certain attitude, even in the midst of a dark situation. But there's also something else going on under the surface that's deeper than Jonah's words, that's happening in the deepest parts, not of a fish, but of Jonah. And the author clues us into it in the most interesting and wildest of ways. And the author actually leaves breadcrumbs for us in the text about what's going on inside of Jonah in the way that he writes this text. And the way that he writes it is actually lost on us in our English translations. But when you look at the original text, there's this tiny detail that when you see it, you can't unsee it. And when you see it, you become so fascinated by it that it just opens up the text in color in a way that wasn't there before. There's this thing that happens when you read it in the original language that blows my mind. Let me tell you what happens. All the time that Jonah's in the fish, and throughout this experience at different moments, this is wild. Some of y'all think this is crazy. The fish changes gender. Watch the way that the author actually writes this in the original language. But to understand this, we have to understand a couple of things about original Hebrew, okay? There's 2 words for the word fish. Again, some of y'all, I just lost half of you, okay? I'm going to say, some of y'all are like, this is wild. I know it's wild, but it's the coolest thing when you see it. Listen, okay. In the original Hebrew language, there's 2 words for fish. The first word is dog. Everybody say dog. That's pretty good. It's about as good as we're going to get, for being not Hebrew people, Is the word that kind of describes a male fish, right? It does describe a male fish, right? But in the Hebrew language, a lot of nouns are masculine and feminine. They have 2 forms of the nouns. A lot of languages are like that. They have masculine and feminine forms of nouns. And the feminine form of the noun for fish is daga. Everybody say daga. Okay. Now, when you look at this in the original language, the author shifts the word that he uses in the middle of the story, and then shifts it back at the end of the chapter. Look at this. In Jonah 1:17, he says, "Now the Lord had arranged for a great dog, a great male fish, to come and to swallow Jonah." Okay. Not one verse later, he changes the noun and tells us that then Jonah prayed to the Lord, his God, from inside the daga. Okay. Now, what's interesting about this, too, is the original Hebrew, this word inside can just as easily be translated belly. It can just as easily be translated womb. Okay, there's several different ways that this gets translated consistently throughout the ancient Hebrew text. Okay, so then Jonah prays inside the daga. And then the Lord orders the dog to spit Jonah out onto the beach. Now, this is where I told you a minute ago. If you look at this and you try to make every little detail of this fit perfectly in a way that just connects all the dots, you got to go through intellectual gymnastics to make all this make sense. In fact, a long time ago, there was this rabbi, this is so fun, this rabbi who tried to synchronize these different forms of the nouns that are used. And you know what he said? He goes, well, it seems to me that the Lord had a great male fish swallow Jonah. And Jonah seemed to be a little bit too comfortable in that male fish. And so he had a very pregnant female fish come along and had the male fish spit Jonah into the mouth of the female fish. And I'm like, I don't even know how that happened. Making out? How does this work? And then it's just like this wild story to try to fill in the gaps, right? Just to make it make sense. You could do everything you can to try to make it make sense, right? You do everything you want to there. All right, you try. But the reality is, there's a much simpler explanation to all of this. And it seems as if, in the way that authors often do today and did them, in the most poetic and most beautiful of ways, the author is actually conveying to us the idea that, hey, that whole time that Jonah was inside the fish, it's as if the fish was pregnant with Jonah. And you're that just seems weird. But here's what's actually happening to Jonah through this process. It's a process that some of you have experienced before. Jonah isn't just being rescued in this moment. He's being reborn through this experience. Now, some of you have had experiences like this in your life, right? For some of you, you've actually watched people go through the wildest of transformations that did not make sense to you but yet you couldn't deny. Some of you have watched people go through some of the most difficult of circumstances. Some of you have dropped one person off at rehab, and weeks later, you picked up a completely different person from rehab. Some of you have hired one person, and a few years later, you realize you had a completely different person working for you. Some of you have had really difficult seasons with one family member, and you showed up a few years later to Christmas, and all of a sudden, they were a completely different person. I mean, they had the same birth certificate. They had the same social security number. They had the same name. But in so many ways, they were massively different. Some of you have experienced this yourself. I've got a friend, I'll never forget. He had launched a new organization, had so many hopes and dreams and expectations for it. I remember he called me one day and he said, "Hey, we're shutting it down. It's done." I said, "What are you going to do?" He goes, I don't have it all figured out yet. So we decided to meet up. We met up at a Panera Bread. We're going to kind of just talk and connect and just hear how things were going in that season. He pulls into Panera Bread in a box truck, like a moving truck. Like his car had died and he had the box truck from a previous business and it was just all he had. So he's just driving a moving truck around, not moving anything. You know what I mean? Just driving around. Looks like a dog snatcher. I know, it's like the weirdest of things. I'm just like, hey, it's what I got. He pulls in, we sit down, we're talking. And he's just starting to put the pieces together. And I was thinking about him this week. Because if you looked at his life this week, you would have never guessed that he'd lost an organization, that he wasn't sure what was going to be next, that he had been driving a box truck all around his city day after day after day. So many of you have seen people like this. So many of you have had experiences like this. It's those moments, those seasons in the in-between. Those moments of those seasons where you're not in the worst of it, but you're not in the best of it either. That transformation actually begins to happen. There's this moment in the life of Jesus that's fascinating, where a Jewish leader, we talked about him last week, a Jewish leader actually comes and begins to talk to Jesus in the middle of the night about things that are happening through Jesus in that season. And Jesus makes this statement to him. It's a fascinating statement. He says, hey, if you want to see the kingdom of God, in other words, hey, if you want to see everything that's going on in the world right now, if you want to see things as God intends them to be, he goes, you have to be born again. To which this Jewish leader is like, what are you talking about, dude? That's great. Like, I can't do that. I can't like squeeze back in there. Is like literally what he pretty much asked. You know what I mean? Like, I can't. It's like how's that work? And Jesus begins to unpack that for him over and over and over. Starts to explain it, and then he kind of summarizes it. He says this. He's like, hey, he goes, you know how you know the wind exists, but you don't feel the wind, you don't hear the wind, but yet you see the impacts of the wind. He's like, that's the same way that God's Spirit works in your life. He goes, and he literally goes, you can't explain it, but you can certainly experience it. Now, those are the seasons of life for so many of us that we resist, we push back, we run from, we try to get out of as fast as we possibly can. And I just suggest this morning. If you're in a season like that, be careful not to run from the very thing that God is using to recreate you. Or for some of us, I might just say it this way. For some of us, you're still looking for a ferry, the best possible way out, when God already sent a fish, right? Like, you're still waiting for the perfect job when God already sent you the right job for right now. Or you're still waiting for like the perfect partner to come along and do life with, when God already sent you the right friends for right now in this season. Or you're waiting for like the opportunity to buy that first house or pay off your car or like fully stock your emergency fund in all the ways that everybody tells you that you're supposed to do. And yet God provided everything that you needed for today. And in the same way that he walked with Jonah into the depths of the world and back to the surface, He's going to walk with you through it all. But it might not happen in a moment. And it might not happen as fast as you want it to. Because there's actually something that he wants to do inside of you. And so as we wrap up our time together this morning, we're going to end our time really in the same way that Jonah ended his time inside of a fish. Remember what his last words were to us? He said, "But I will sacrifice to you with songs of praise. I'm going to be grateful to you even when I'm sitting in the deepest parts of it. I'm going to be thankful for you. Even when I'm in the darkest of moments. I'm not out of this yet, but I'm also not in the worst part of it either. And I'm going to sit in this. And I'm going to sing to you. Because why? Because my salvation, my saving, my way out of this, it isn't here yet. But when it comes, and I know it's coming, it comes from you. So earlier this morning, we sang a song. We actually learned a song this morning. I'll tell you, there's a line from that song that's been on my heart all week long. It's a line that says this. It said, it's always been you every season of life. Every long, restless night. Some of you walked in here this morning right out of one of these. You spent all last night tossing and turning. You kind of slept, but you didn't really sleep. So it's always been you. The highs and the lows, the ebbs and the flows. And I just wonder if for some of us, these words are your life right now. And so before we wrap up, I want to give you the chance to actually sing a song of praise in the middle of your fish. So here's what I'm going to ask us to do, if we would. Just, if you would, stand up with me. We're just going to go ahead and stand up now. Let's just prepare to sing. Let me say this. Let me say one more thing. As you're standing, there's this interesting moment in the book of Jonah. This fascinating thing about the prayer that we just read. And we don't have time to map all of this out. Okay? But the poem that we read, that's Jonah's prayer, you want to know something interesting about that? This is fascinating. Don't miss this. Most of it is actually plagiarized. Okay? What I mean by that is simply this. Most of it is actually what's called a pastiche. It's a fancy word that kind of it communicates the idea of like cutting and pasting thoughts to create something, like putting different pieces together to create something out of it. And if you study, we don't have time for this today, but if you were to study every word of Jonah's prayer, you know what you're going to find? Is that the bulk of those words were actually taken from words that a man named David had written hundreds of years before Jonah. And he had written those words down in songs of praise of his own. And he had written those words down in prayers of his own. And Jonah inside the belly of a fish, actually the bulk of what he prays are actually words from David's prayers and David's songs. And I say that to simply say this to you this morning. When you're in the deepest part of it, like when you're in the thickest part of it all, sometimes you find yourself, like I find myself, wanting to pray but without the words to pray. Looking for something to say but not finding it. Opening your mouth and just finding, I got nothing for this. And sometimes what you need in those moments is actually the words of somebody else to pray with you and partner with you and pray on your behalf. To give you the words to say and to pray when you don't have them. For some of us this morning, I just can only imagine that might be the space that you're in. And so here's what we're going to do. If that's you this morning, this is going to be a little different. We're just going to try, okay? If that's you this morning and you find yourself in that space, and you're standing near someone who you know and who you trust. You go, hey, I need someone to pray on my behalf this morning. I want you right now just give them like a nudge. Just give them an elbow. Just a little like, hey, I need you in this with me this morning. And I'm serious, if you need that, do that. It might be a spouse. It might be a friend. It might be somebody from dinner party. Give them a nudge. No, let me say this. If someone just nudged you, I'm going to ask you to do something that might be just slightly out of your comfort zone. When we begin to sing this song, I'm going to ask you just to maybe put your hand on their shoulder as a way of saying, hey, I'm getting in this with you. And I'm going to pray not just for you. I'm going to pray on your behalf in a moment in a season where you might not have the words to say. And as we sing this song, if you feel comfortable, I just want to encourage you, even in that moment, just to begin to pray with and for them. Now, I'll also say this. Some of us this morning, you find yourself standing here and you wish you had someone to nudge, but they're not there for you. They're not next to you. I just want to tell you this. Every Sunday, there's a team of people in the back left corner of our room who would love the opportunity to pray with you. That's what they do, and they're so good at it. And if that's you this morning, I just want to encourage you, as we sing this song, just to step out of your seat, walk to the back left corner of the room, and allow one of them to pray for you, to pray with you, and to pray on your behalf. Can you do that this morning? I think you can do that this morning. Let me pray for us together, and then we'll sing and pray together. Jesus, I thank you for the ways that you work in our lives that are so mysterious and don't make any sense to us. For the ways that you show up in the darkest of moments. God, I join some of my friends in the room this morning who find themselves in their own fish, in their deepest part of it. God, they're not in the worst part of it anymore, and for that we say thank you, but they're still in the thick of it, and it's still unresolved. Jesus, would you help us to trust you today with those seasons? Would you give us the patience to wait them out, to allow you to do your good work in us? God, would you also give us hope? God, we praise you for what you've done. God, we're going to praise you for what you haven't done yet, but what we know you can do and what we trust you to do. We love you. We thank you for this. It's in Christ's name we pray. Amen. If you want someone to pray with you this